Well, I think this is what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry, is the vertical axis in many ways can't be measured by the efficacy of drugs because everybody's drug tries to be as efficacious as possible, but rather it's the size of the market for the drug. Blockbusters are much more financially attractive to a pharmaceutical company than are small market drugs. And if you're a $10 million or a $40 million company and you want to grow at 25% a year in order to sustain your stock price, it means next year you've got to find 10 million in new business. If you have become a $40 billion company and you want to grow at 25% a year, it means next year you've got to find 10 billion in new business. And there just aren't any emerging markets that are $10 billion in size. And so what you see happening in the pharma industry is that 20 years ago, a drug that attacked a market that was maybe $100 million in size, that was a reasonably attractive product at that time to what are known today as the big pharma companies. But then as they grew and as they merged and consolidated operations and got bigger and bigger by merger after merger, pretty soon a $100 million drug couldn't turn anybody's head, but gosh, if you give me $1 billion drug now, that's a blockbuster. I'll invest in that. And then they merge and consolidate and merge and get bigger. And pretty soon $1 billion drug doesn't make any difference, but now give me a $5 billion drug. And what's happened as the companies have gotten bigger and bigger, they've chased the blockbusters up market, unable to prioritize small market opportunities, just like the integrated mills were unable to prioritize rebar, or General Motors is unable to prioritize subcompacts. And you got to ask yourself, as Peter showed that alarming data on the increasing cost per new approved molecule, is this because the decline in the number of drugs being approved, is it because the science is tired? If you just think about it for 10 seconds, that cannot be the case. But just like as in the integrated steel companies, never did the CEOs make a deliberate decision to get killed, but rather their flight up market was really the sum of all of the decisions of R&D people, plant schedulers, salespeople, and so on, who decide what to prioritize, what not to prioritize. And all of those distributed decisions led to the decision that led to their bankruptcy. I think this is going on in the pharmaceutical companies. Molecules appear really at unprecedented rates, but because few of them pass muster as the mega blockbusters that are required to make a dent in Pfizer's top line, they just can't get the resources required to push them across the goal line. And so you see this mismatch of massive amounts of capital just being misspent and unspent because so few drugs meet the requirement at the high end of their market. Now I'd like to just flip ahead. A good way to describe disruption is that in every market, you can kind of describe the structure of a market in geographic terms through a series of concentric circles. At the beginning of most industries, the technical problems are resolved at the periphery. For example, in computing, when I was in college, if I needed to compute, I just whipped out my slide rule, did the estimation, and got on with life. But in that industry, as in almost every industry, the advent of sophisticated technology that made us much more powerful and productive in solving problems, the sophistication and costliness of that technology drove the industry to centralize. Because mainframe computers were so costly and so complicated, we couldn't have them at the periphery of life so that we could solve problems wherever they arose, but rather we had to take our problems to the university or the corporate mainframe center and give the problem in the form of a stack of punched cards to a skilled operator who did the job for us. That centralization of the industry allowed us to do more powerful things, but it was so costly that we didn't compute very often. That then set in motion a set of disruptive innovations, each one of which followed the process that I've shown on the prior graph of starting at a simple application and then improving. And geographically, what it did was it decentralized the industry again. So Digital Equipment Corporation brought the mini computer, which took computing out of central accounting and finance into the engineering department. And then Apple and IBM brought computing to our office or our home. Then the notebook put it in our briefcase, and the handheld puts it in our pocket or our purse. Every one of those innovations was disruptive in that it brought to a much larger population of people who had less training the ability financially to afford the product and the ability skill-wise to use the product because of their progressive simplicity. Each time you moved out a circle in that structure, the size of the market increased by a factor of 10. But always it was a new company that brought that simplifying, affordability, and enhancing technology to the market because of the financial unattractiveness of the new to the people who were ensconced in the prior generation. When companies don't move out, but rather they stay and compete within a circle, head-on competition on a sustaining basis drives cost up. And so as hospitals compete against hospitals, what you see is they add cost, they don't drive cost down. They want to have the very best abilities so that they can compete against their direct competitors. One adds a CAT scanner, everybody adds a CAT scanner. One adds an MRI machine, everybody has to have one. In the Boston area, you listen on news radio, the Boston University Medical Center now is advertising that they're the only one in Boston that has a Da Vinci surgical robot. And you just know that all of the other hospitals are discussing how in the world can we get one of those so that we can compete. And so sustaining innovation, on average, increases cost, doesn't drive it down. It's the wave of disruptive innovations that bring affordability and accessibility. I'm going to skip over this one. Now, in healthcare, it's going through, or it needs to go through, the same process. So when I was a kid, I remember our doctor still made house calls. The solution came to the problem. But the advent of complicated medical technologies has driven a centralization of the healthcare industry. And so these include surgical suites, expensive imaging machines, the big multi-channel testing equipment required to analyze our blood. And so we have to take the problem to the solution in the form of the hospital. I was on the strategy board of the Brigham and Women's Hospital in the Boston area for about a decade. And we did a study there that concluded that about 70% of the patients in the Brigham today would have been in the ICU 30 years ago. About 70% of the patients in our ICU today would have been dead 30 years ago. In terms of the model of disruption, if the vertical axis is the complexity of diagnosing and treating the disease, our hospitals have become extraordinarily capable of doing unimaginable things. And in a similar way, our specialist physicians have become extraordinarily capable, but in the process of adding all of that capability and cost, they've actually overshot the amount of care that people in with mainstream illnesses can utilize when they get admitted to a hospital or see a doctor, even though they have to pay for all of it.